I'm John Dennis. I'm running against Nancy Pelosi.
We have the most beautiful state and one of the most beautiful places in the world, and people are leaving.
I'm gonna catch you when all the cameras aren't around, and I'm gonna you up. I'm tired.
He's the chairman of the San Francisco GOP, and he's running against House Speaker Nancy Pelosi.
Step back, everyone.
All right. Welcome, John Dennis Report. How are you? Thanks for joining us today. Please, before we get started, hey, can you please subscribe to us on John Dennis Report on YouTube? I'd be grateful if you did that. And also John Dennis Report on Facebook. On Twitter, if you want to follow me, it's at Real John Dennis, where things have been rather lively lately, and Instagram as well. Instagram, if you're curious, I actually cook a little bit on the weekends, and I do most of my posting about what the heck I'm cooking. Yesterday I did, and when I say cook, I mean, guy cooking stuff. It's not to say that I can't get around a kitchen, but I'm talking mostly like grilling, My wife gave me a big green egg for Christmas last fall, and I've been kicking up a storm on that thing. This weekend I did a pork belly. You can see that there. But I also post occasionally some political stuff on Instagram, so please follow me there as well. And I'm really glad to see you all today. Oh man, one of the things that I have been assiduously avoiding. I mean, I touch it occasionally because you really can't avoid it entirely. And I'm doing this topic reluctantly today, is the topic of racism. Racism, I got to give the Democrats a little bit of credit, but almost like when you admire evil done well, evil, with a plan that was executed well. You got to go, well, at least they covered the plan. They did it pretty well. It's almost admirable. But I have to tell you, from a polemics point of view, from an argumentation point of view, the topic of racism is the fact that the Democrats got there first and staked their planted their flag in that lot in that area was pretty brilliant, pretty genius, I gotta say, because it's a really awful topic to cover. It gives cover to them, and it automatically puts the person who gets accused of it on the defensive. And it's kind of a really ugly thing that you don't want to deal with. And I talked last week a little bit about how it's I think the last person to make sort of an even oblique sort of joke regarding like sex and politics, at least on the presidential level, was Bill Clinton. I seem to recall him doing an awkward flirtation with the late Helen Thomas, who was much older at the time. And Clinton was somebody who admired JFK, including all the affairs, I think, and he modeled himself on that presidency in many regards, including the scandalous parts. But he's the last guy I can remember, certainly on a presidential level, even having some sort of a flirtatious, weird thing there. So you don't talk about that, and then also race and racism itself, unless you're talking about it in like the most clinical terms. And I should say you don't want to talk about it, and people didn't really, in that regard, in a sense of like charging their opponents with that charge. Up until, say, recent times, I'd say in the last 10, 15 years is when it's really come up, where one party has sort of co-opted the issue and then forced it on the other party. The reality is Dinesh D'Souza frequently says the history of the Democrat Party was based in racism, and the Ku Klux Klan was was an adjunct organization to the Democrat Party, and was helped to institutionalize racism around the South, and really if any organization, a large political party was going to be accused of some sort of racism, it would really be the Democrats. But they have seized it and really focused it back on the Republicans. And I just, it's just such an awful topic. It's such a hurtful and harmful topic. I've certainly, I've grown up around people who have made racist comments. And I've been around, some places where people would, say things racist. I have to tell you, when I lived in Europe, I heard a kind of a level of racism I'd never heard in this country. People said things. But I have found, generally, I find that those circumstances have been the exception. And I have found that listen, I would say it if it was otherwise. If it wasn't true, I'd say it in another. I'd call it out if it wasn't true. But my experience has been is that the American people are very anti-racist, and they really they don't like it. They strive to treat each other as equals with mutual respect. They try and live by the golden rule. Treat people the way you want to be treated. But I think that also because, and there's also sort of like an understanding and a collective guilt about the fact that there was this awful institution of slavery in this country, and people I think are particularly sensitive about that, and they want to somehow find a way to to rise above it, just to right that wrong, even though they themselves, didn't perpetrate it. So I don't know. I just find it a very awkward subject. I'm even finding it awkward right now talking about it, but they just keep thrusting it on us over and over and over and over again. And, there are two people, one who I won't name, one who I will, who I think of, and what an injustice it is to these two men, who happen to be, white men, who to me are just role models of, excellence in different ways. One of them is a coach, and I think when I think of this person, I think of all of the coaches in high schools, colleges, grade schools, professional sports around this whole country who work with other, with athletes of different backgrounds, religions, races, all sorts of differences. And they are, for me, a metaphor for the country. They go into each other's homes and establish relationships with the entire family in terms of, recruiting players for high school and for college, and on the grade school level, and even on the professional level. They come together to try and achieve a mutual goal of winning and creating success and successful cultures, just to varying degrees, but that's ultimately the goal. And all the other stuff melts away. The characteristics, and what happens is people come together and they learn when they're pursuing this goal to notice the differences, but only in the sense that they're going to enhance the experience. That you're going to get to learn about other people's cultures while you're pursuing, this goal of success. And so to me, that's America. I mean, that's, and I'm thinking about this one particular person who was in my well-known person who was in my town, who achieved an enormous amount of success, almost exclusively working with people, with kids of other backgrounds, mostly Black and Hispanic kids. And never, when in my witness, first-hand experience up close and personal with this person, I never saw race brought up. It was never an issue. And again, this guy, white guy, worked almost, largely, I'd say probably 85% of the kids he worked with were Black. And it never came up. It was not an issue. He would yell at those kids equally if they screwed up. He didn't care what color they were. He would praise them if they did well, irrespective of their color. He might pick out certain personalities and realize that some of them needed a little more pushing than others, but it was never the skin color that mattered, and it was just above. It was all above that, and he's just again an example of that that mentality that is part of every coach, I think, in the country. Probably some exceptions, but it's a real travesty to those people who are a metaphor to the country when people on the left, progressives, point the finger so casually and so with such facility, calling other people racist, people with whom they have no familiarity. They don't know their life stories. They don't know the things they've tried to accomplish, and to insult their decency like that is it's deflating and infuriating at the same time, if you know what I mean. It's that same sort of feeling, and it just came up today. And what's interesting about it is that, and I mentioned the Democrats earlier, is because the truth of the matter is in politics that the Democrats are the ones who historically institutionalized racism. And when you hear of racial incidents and episodes, I don't know, can anybody tell me the last time a Republican actually, got caught saying something racial or doing something that was racially insensitive or actually being blatantly, overtly racist? Because I can't recall any. And I'd be the first person to point them out and say, I disavow this person and everything they said. But you find that on the left, it happens all the time in their private conversations, in the things they do, their tweets, their social media following. It happens all the time, which brings me to the reason why I brought this up, because in the Bay Area now, and this is happening across the country, but it's especially true in the Bay Area, we have a large Asian population. We are seeing lots of incidents of Asian folks being attacked, elderly Asian folks largely. And we'll pull up that article in the Chronicle there, Mario. Yeah. So I don't want to see the pictures. You can just Google that yourself. You can see what's going on. But what's happening is, what's interesting is that we have someone who's on the Board of Education here, one of the commissioners, and I guess she's biracial. I can't really tell. But this person is like exactly the problem and the hypocrisy on the progressive line. Okay. So here she is. First of all, she's supposed to be biracial. Husband is in finance or something. They live in a $4 million house in one of the most exclusive neighborhoods in San Francisco, by the way, right? So it's a nice neighborhood, really charming place, not far from where I live. Probably she has better views than I do. And a $4 million house that they got, by the way, in a nice deal. And she's got 2 kids. I don't know where they go to school. My suspicion is that they go to private schools, but I don't know that just yet, but I'm going to find that out eventually. But this woman, Allison Collins, I'm going to call her out, has been constantly, pushing anti-racism, and this is racist and that's racist, almost invariably directed at at Republicans. But if we can pull up, can you pull up those her tweets there? The ones that are there. You go. Pull them all up. Yeah, there's not those. The ones down that are actually in the photograph. Yeah. The ones that. Yeah, that. Go back. Hold on. Let me do it. Let go. This is what I want to highlight. Yeah. Can people see that?
Yes, they can.
Oh, good. Okay. So just go ahead and read through this. And she can say, I'm looking to combat anti-black racism in the Asian community at my daughter's mostly Asian American school. Now, I got to find out where that school is, by the way, because this is one of the people this is a separate issue, but this commissioner has been one of the people who has been fighting hard to keep the public schools closed. She's on the San Francisco Board of Education, and she's fighting to keep the public schools closed. Meanwhile, I'm going to bet money that her kids are in private schools, by the way, which are all back in San Francisco. In San Francisco, the public schools are still doing, distance learning, and the private schools are back. And it is just clearly, obnoxiously clear that that the teachers' unions in cahoots with the Board of Education are, just being lazy, and they don't want to go back to school. They want paid vacations, and they're doing it at the expense of our kids. But anyway, set that aside. She goes, many Asian students and teachers, as our S&Ts are, and I know won't engage in critical race convos unless they see how they are impacted by white supremacy. Oh, yeah. I grew up in mostly Asian American schools, and I know this experience all too well. Many Asian Americans believe they benefit from the model minority BS. In fact, many American Asian students, teachers, and I don't know what the P's are, parents, actively promote these myths. They use white supremacist thinking to assimilate and get ahead. So, what I find funny is that, Republicans are like 7% of San Francisco. We don't run anything. We have not one elected Republican official in this town. In this area, in the Bay Area, you have virtually no elected Republican officials. It's all, run by the Democrats. In San Francisco specifically, it's all run by the progressive left. And they say the most racist, horrible things about people that you can possibly imagine. And, to talk to many at Lowell. Lowell's the school that this Board of Education just changed the admission standards. Lowell was a school that, in order to get into, you had to have, it was a merit-based system. You had to have good scores and grades and that sort of thing. And her Board of Education, she and all but one of the commissioners on the Board of Education decided to change the merit system at Lowell High School because there weren't enough minorities there. Now, that was news to almost all the people who ever went to Lowell. But these people decided to take the crown jewel, such as it is in the San Francisco public education system, and destroy it because it wasn't achieving their ends. It's sort of like that song by the band Rush, "The Trees." Read that in order to make sure that the folks, the smaller trees, can get some light. They're going to cut down all the tall trees, and that's what they're doing here. They're just destroying. They're not helping the families of different cultures that aren't doing well. They're just going to harm the ones who are doing well. And so that's really the game here. And so the point that I guess I'm really making about all this topic that I absolutely hate is that in progressive places you really have the worst circumstances and the worst instances of overt racism, and it's sort of inevitable. They are trying desperately to change the definition of racism from one of just hating people based on an immutable characteristic, something you can't change about yourself, a skin color. They're changing it to say, it's based on, racism is actually is justified when someone has power and you're in the less dominant, your culture is in the less dominant position. Okay, whatever. Sounds like a fancy way of giving your excuse to be a despicable human being, but okay, fine. But again, it comes back to the people who actually want to make a difference. These folks don't want to make a difference, because if they did, they'd say to themselves, well, look, we have been pointing out this issue of racism and how it's impacting people, and but how has it actually improved the lives of the folks who they're trying to help? all this screaming about critical race theory and all that, how has that improved the lives of minorities? Has it improved them at all? If they spent that time, instead of talking about critical race theory, talking about success habits, setting goals, plans, learning strategy, tactics, understanding, timelines in life. I mean, those kinds of things. Having, the fundamentals of, cultures that praise and reward having, two-parent households. All those things. Instead of talking, if they talked this much about those issues as opposed to critical race theory, do you know how much more successful, poor and minority communities would be if they talked about the success habits that that people need to have in order to improve their lot and their circumstances. If they talked about that instead of critical race theory, do you know how much better off they'd be? And this brings me back to the other thing I wanted to button up. I talked about the high school basketball coach in that metaphor and what a disservice it is that they have all of these conversations. I also think about guys like Ron Paul, who many of you know I'm a big fan of. I was grateful to help with his presidential campaigns. And Ron, in a sort of this circle of life thing, came back and endorsed and campaigned for me. In the past. And, Ron's just such a very nice, sweet, classy guy who they were, trying to pin the Republicans, certainly the left was, but even Republicans were trying to pin this racism charge against him. And it was just a terrible thing. He's such a sweet person. Would never be that way. And someone actually in his 2012 campaign uncovered a story about it, how a mixed couple, interracial couple, black and white, came into a hospital with some trouble. They were having some trouble in their pregnancy. And Ron was an OBGYN, and they weren't getting any service in Texas. And they thought, oh, maybe it's because of our race. And then Ron came out and said, have you been helped? And they're like, no. And he said, well, let me come in and help you, and help the woman who sadly had a miscarriage. And then, Ron made sure that they never paid the bill. And this was after these kinds of really sleazy, sleazy accusations. They couldn't argue with him in terms of the validity of the points that he was making. So they really just tried to smear him with that. And I just feel like this is really kind of the lowest form of politics, is racism. It's rarely true, and when it's been true, it's largely been true of folks on the progressive left who constantly see things in terms of color. And, I'm reluctantly talking about it today because I just kind of wanted to get this off my chest. I hope to not ever have to discuss this again. I suppose I will. But these are my thoughts on it. I just think it's the most despicable thing. And, and it's what's crazy is that, like, for example, when this guy who I had this confrontation with last year, at the cleanup last February, when it came up to me, he said he wanted me dead. And I said, why? And he said, because you're a racist. I was like, my first reaction was like, I grew up in a public housing project. And I was really hung up on that because, I grew up in Jersey City in a public housing project in a largely black community, a community that actually evolved and eventually became largely black. By the time we moved out of the projects when I was like 12, almost 13 years old, we were like one of the few white families that was left there. So, I mean, I've been, and Jersey City was I went to high school blacks and this, grammar school with black kids. And I just, we were just friends, and it wasn't, it's just so embarrassing to me that someone would say something like that and then force me to have to explain my whole history. And I find that most of these people who want to quote unquote help minorities haven't lived around very many minorities, because the thing that I found is that minorities of all stripes can pretty much take care of themselves if you just leave them alone. And helping, particularly government help, is what weakens communities. And that's the most anti-racist thing that you can do, is get the government out of people's lives and let them take care of themselves. Don't treat them like your project that you have to help, because when you help, you weaken. Ultimately, I mean, not to say that there shouldn't be some form of help that where people who've really down on their luck, but the more aggressively that you extend that help, the worse it is for the people who you were intending to help, and that's the truth of the matter. And as I said before, I've found that minorities of all stripes are perfectly capable of taking care of themselves if people just simply won't help the way that they want to now, at least the way the progressives do. So, in any event, let me move on from that. I just want to kind of tie into that. The fact that progressives are failing on race, progressives are failing on homelessness. One of the things that Bernie Sanders, who I saw a really dumb tweet this morning about aimed at Elon Musk, was Bernie was talking. Bernie's always yelling about income inequality. He talked about it in that tweet. But meanwhile, have you ever found that the most progressive places have all three of those problems? You have the worst issues of racism. You have the worst issues of homelessness, and you have the worst issues of gender inequality. Let's use San Francisco as an example. We have every politician who's elected in this town considers themselves a progressive of some sort. You might get away with saying that of the 11 supervisors, one of them is moderate, maybe, but the other 10 are clearly progressives and identify as such. The mayor probably would identify as a progressive, but she's a little bit more realistic about things like housing and other issues. But if you look in this town, you have this situation where this woman on the board of education, who is clearly obsessed with the race and creating race problems. We have a city now where elderly Asian Americans, lots of different types, but particularly the elderly, are being attacked. Again, 7% Republicans. These are not Republicans who are doing this, right? These are the people who are doing the attacks are likely to be, if they're registered to vote, they're likely to be registered Democrats. And this is driven in a town that's managed completely by progressive Democrats, right? Homelessness. We have the highest homelessness per capita in the country here in San Francisco. And in terms of income inequality, while we have the highest homelessness per capita, we have more billionaires in San Francisco than any place on earth per capita. And it's not really even close. So you want to talk about income inequality, the sorts of things that Bernie Sanders is concerned about. It's the sorts of issue that Democrats are supposedly concerned about. We have them. We have all three of those problems in spades in San Francisco. It's because they don't understand the problems and they don't understand what causes them, and they are just making things worse. And that's why I think people are coming in. We're not in the numbers that I would like to see, but people are registering as Republicans. We've had an increase in Republican registration in San Francisco consistently for the last almost 2 years. And people are beginning to see the light. That this is really driven by people being focused on the wrong things. So anyway, I've seen all sorts of things where they're so committed to the ideology that they refuse to ignore what the actual issues are. Like, for example, I ran for supervisor a few years back, and I talked about how people are coming in from that. Oh, there's no way that all the homeless people who are living in San Francisco are native San Franciscans. There are incentives to come and be homeless. If you are a drug addicted person who wants to live on the street and score drugs, San Francisco is ideal. During the early phases of the pandemic, even right now, San Francisco was putting people up into empty hotel rooms and giving them drugs or making drugs available to them. You want to live that lifestyle, this is it. We had last year, we had way more overdoses, largely driven by fentanyl, overdose deaths than we did COVID deaths. They were up 70% in 1 year. We have people coming in, and I was talking about the outside influence. I made that point, by the way, that point about people coming in from outside of San Francisco really doesn't help the narrative for the progressives, because they want to make it seem like these are sons and daughters of San Francisco who've fallen on hard times, and we have a bad system and we got to fix it. But that's just not true. And there was a tweet or article I saw about some homeless folks saying that, hey, look, you see a bunch of tatted up white guys coming in who definitely didn't grow up here. They're from northern counties and California counties. Great place to be homeless for them. But that doesn't fit the progressive narrative. They they say they're all sons and daughters of San Francisco, graduates of Lowell High School who are living out on the streets. They refuse to look at it. They just because they it really just goes against their narrative, and doesn't help them. Same thing with income inequality. I mean, they make sure that the insiders and the folks who put up all the money for their seminars and their retreats and that sort of thing to talk about how they're going to change the world to make a difference, they make sure that those folks end up getting a good deal, so that they can they can keep funding all the liberal and progressive plans they have to assuage their guilt out of being so successful. So these are the things that you find: racism, homelessness, income inequality. The three things that progressives are supposed to be fighting against are worse in the places where they run them, and that's just the truth. So that's that for the day. So we've covered racism, we've covered progressive failure, and now let's move on to Joe Biden's border nightmare. If you could pull that up, Mario, that would be great. Yeah. I mean, there are a lot of stories out there about this, but I like to always give Project Veritas a little bump. I know Axios put something out too, but James I've met. James is a good dude. He's really he in private conversation he talks exactly the same way as he does live on camera. I mean, he's just committed to sort of the Andrew Breitbart, which is an appropriate. It's appropriate that we're looking at their website. He's sort of I think he knew Andrew, and he was taking on that way of fighting against the progressive left. And here you see pictures and now we know why the Biden administration, which promised to be the most transparent in history, why they didn't want reporters down at the border, because look at what we have. We have cages, effectively cages, with people who look like baked potatoes all lined up in in holding pens, including children, wrapped up in those kinds of foil sheets that they use, after somebody's run a marathon or something to help keep heat in. Lined up, like I said, like a rack of baked potatoes in an oven. And this is the reason why they didn't want you down there. And what's interesting is that there was a clip last week where they did it side by side. Someone was kind enough to say, George Stephanopoulos saying, hey, the migrants who are coming up are under the impression that you want them to come up, that things are going to be easier because you're the president. And he goes, no, that's not true. I don't want them to come up. Don't come. Meanwhile, last summer in the Democrat debates, he was telling migrants, come up and surge the border. I mean, the guy's like, he can't keep track of what he's saying anymore. He said something just last summer, come in up to the border. And those people said, oh, Joe Biden got elected. He said, surge the border. Well, here we come. And then he's denying that he's responsible for the problem. He gave the impression that he wanted them to come here because he said it. And then he gave the impression that he wanted them to come here because he stopped building the wall. And now we have this massive problem going on at the border. And so what do? They do what all bad governments do. They cover it up. But unfortunately, we live in a world now where cameras are ubiquitous. They're everywhere. And, it's actually, here's a conversation I had when I sat next to James when we had dinner, when he came and spoke in San Francisco, James O'Keefe. I said to him, I was, the nightmare scenario, and forgive me, by the way, if you don't know, the big computer that I look at is over here, which has the data that I'm looking to talk about. But when in speaking to James, I said to him, what's interesting about 1984, the book 1984, is that in there the citizens live in terror because the cameras are hidden everywhere. They're all over the place, and they're always directed at the citizens. But one of the things that Orwell didn't foresee was that the cameras would also be aimed at the people ruling us. And as long as you have the ability to transmit information freely, we have a fighting chance against the powers that be, because we have these cameras everywhere. They can be hidden anywhere. And James looked at me and he was like, yeah, we had this conversation about it. And then he got up and he spoke. And sure enough, that part of 19. He brought that up. It was one of his slides about how they were using cameras to go. It was the exact same point. And so, Biden can think that he's going to get away with these fibs. At least he might have thought he could get. I mean, in the 70s and the 60s and the 80s and even 90s, they might have been able to get away with these kinds of things. But it's not going to happen anymore. You can't get away with these kinds of tragic policies that create tragic circumstances, and you're just not going to get away with it because there are cameras everywhere, and it's going to come out sooner or later. And this goes back to another point that I made. In fact, I'm going to revisit this topic because I think it's worthwhile. But you think about it, Biden is the perfect monster. Because you almost, when you start blaming him for these atrocious policies that are, creating, horrors at places like the border and awful conditions for people, you think about that and you realize that, he's kind of out of it. And are these really his policies? You got to, just to make me laugh, this has been kind of a heavy day. Do you have that picture on hand, by the way, Mario? That one of Biden with the blank stare?
I can pull it up.
Yeah, pull it up because it's my favorite picture. But I mean, so you look at him and you're like, it's not really him that's doing it. It's all the people behind the scenes who are doing these things. And so as a result, it gives him license. And the people who are behind the scenes, the faceless people behind the scenes who are, doing all these terrible things, you don't know who's in charge, and they can keep doing these awful things because there's no repercussions. And the media is, not going to really challenge him. Although I will say that Jake Tapper was giving somebody the business the other day. He was challenging Gavin Newsom. So, but for the most part, the media is not really challenging him. So he can just keep going away, committing these kind of atrocities. Not the sort of atrocities like where you nuke a country in the Middle East or something like that. But, I mean, it's really terrible stuff. And, he can keep getting away with it because he looks like this. Put that picture up. I mean, let me just say this, and it's not just Donald Trump, but Barack Obama never had a picture like this. George W. Bush never had a picture like this. Bill Clinton didn't have any pictures like this. I mean, look at this with the mouth open and just the eyes sort of blanked over. And, he has moments where he seems lucid. But you see, I'm old enough to remember him in the 80s when he was really lucid and he was really dumb. So even lucidity doesn't help him because he's not really capable. So, I mean, in this regard, you look at him, he's like, he's kind of like cognitively gone. And so you don't really have any recourse in going after these policies of his. So I don't know. Anyway, he's like the perfect monster. It's going to be really, really difficult. And then if they really do have these systems in place right now to rig elections, I don't know what to think. I mean, it's really terrifying. So I guess I'll deal with that on another podcast. But we've been going here for a while now, and I want to thank you for your attention, for joining me today. It's always my pleasure to have you, and we'll keep you up. I'll do another one, maybe about Pelosi tomorrow. She was less pressing today, so these other issues were a bit more pressing. Although I have to say, in terms of the progressives, she lets the progressives get away with whatever they want, pretty much, on the national stage and then also on the local stage, and even she has some influence in California as well. So so Pelosi bears responsibility as somebody who wouldn't indulge the progressives. If there was somebody who was in leadership on the House side who didn't indulge the progressives, you'd see less of this kind of failure. But Pelosi is perfectly fine with her as long as she's in charge. So we'll deal with Pelosi tomorrow or another day, depending on what's in the news. But in the meantime, thanks for listening today. Thanks for bearing with me as I talk about the topic. I hate talking about racism, and the insult that it is to the goodness of the American people. But in the meantime, we will have new videos coming up, some pre-recorded stuff. So please follow us on John Dennis Report on YouTube and on Facebook, and then also at Real John Dennis on Instagram and on Twitter. And you have any questions or anything you'd like me to talk about, send me a message, or just tag me in Twitter, or send me something on Facebook, and I'll take a look at it and see if it's something we feel like we can talk about with some insight. And be happy to go over that. And also let me know if there are any guests you think you'd like to have us to have on. Like to see us have on. I mean, Scott Pressler would like to come back. I want to do that again. But I've got some other folks in mind too. So in any event, have a great day. I will see you tomorrow, and good luck in your NCAA brackets. Okay, talk to you soon. Bye.